Hi, my name is Talia Logan. I'm the gallery director here at Olin Galleries, and I'm very excited to announce our new exhibition for the academic year here at Roanoke College. The Coming of the Great Fish is an exhibition of works by the artist Donald Nield, which opens September 10th and runs through October 10th. I'm very pleased to also introduce the two people that will be talking about this show. We have Mike Allen, who is a published writer and reporter for the Roanoke Times, and Esther, who was a neighbor, a friend, and also studio assistant to the artist Donald Nield.
Thank you very much, Talia. Esther, I am interested in hearing from you about who Donald Nield was.
Okay, well, starting at the beginning, he was born in China in 1924, and he lived there until he was about 8. His mother was half Chinese, half Scotch. His grandfather was in the Chinese Maritime Customs, and that whole history in itself interested me. He was told his father died when he was 6. His mother remarried an American who was over there from Goodyear Rubber, and they migrated back to the United States to Michigan. He grew up there until about high school and either was sent away to boarding school or left home or both, and started his journey. He didn't pick up art or painting until around the 1950s. He did a brief foray to California. He married in 48. I believe he divorced immediately or shortly after. And then he started going to museums and libraries. He also knew some artists and worked in studios. I don't know that much about his life around Detroit and Michigan, but he had a couple of years in Detroit and Michigan where he worked, took adult classes, was looking more into becoming a writer. But it was when he moved to New York in the 1950s that he began seriously painting. He took up classes at the Art Students League and other places, and worked during the day, painted at night. And I think it was in 1962. I don't know how this commission came about. I believe probably through a friend of his. He was commissioned to do some paintings for the US Navy and did an aircraft for the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk. He did some paintings of the Wright brothers, and then he did the USS Constellation, and moved from realism into what he self-described as surrealism. He was not a social realist. He was not as surrealist as Dali, Salvador Dali, in that he used more human images and symbolism to put his pictures together. The surrealist part being the irreverent, illogical, irrational, sometimes the placement of things that didn't make sense. And but he didn't have a political or social statement to make like the surrealists did, and he did the early work like a lot of artists did, portraits and commissions, and then moved into the surrealism around 1967 and evolved his own style. He had some attributes like the surrealists and symbolists, and he evolved his own style. He wasn't interested in Freud. He was interested in Carl Jung. So he had more of a, I guess, a spiritual approach. And I don't mean spiritual like religious. I just meant some of his symbols were of the spirit, you know.
That was a thing I wanted to ask you, is if you could talk about how he chose his symbols.
Well, for instance, that I was working on just now, there's a painting in the show called Phantom Angel, and it's kind of a collage in a way. It's got a background of an old train with a person sitting in a seat and a stone cemetery angel in the foreground. And it just came about by taking a walk in the cemetery. He had to go to, I think, a funeral in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx in New York. And this stone angel was there. And who doesn't like stone angels? And so that basically set the seed for just an idea. And that's what I meant by spiritual. There's something about stone angels that evoke some type of response from most people. You know, they either like them or they say, oh, a stone angel. They think of statuary in a cemetery, or they might think of something greater, you know, spiritual journey, death. So he used that. And then he had a picture that he used. Sometimes he collaborated. My sister's husband was a photographer. She took a picture of him, my brother-in-law, out on this train. It was the oldest train left in the railway system, and it went out to Tottenville and had all these nifty old wicker seats and bare light bulbs and these like telescoping windows. Part of that was the skill of the photographer. But so that's how that picture became combined. It wasn't necessarily a message or anything ominous, but it evokes those speculations, you know, those possibilities. So he liked to portray people in these dreamlike states, you know, not sort of in a context of their environment, but also something else. And even though there wasn't a particular story or message, visually, there's usually a story or a message. Does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. That is fascinating. And you also mentioned that not just you, but family members knew Donald. And I wanted to ask how that came about. How did you get to know him and become familiar with his art?
I'll try to keep it brief. My sister is 4 years older than me, and she left home to go to college in New York City. My dad was from New York. We always made trips to New York, either to see upstate, to the Hudson River, downtown, Canal Street, all these different places that we used to go to. So my sister went to school in New York, and I basically followed. In 1969, after I graduated high school, I had enrolled at NYU, but I knew I couldn't afford it and didn't have a major. So I defaulted to City College, which was much more affordable, and moved to my first apartment on 9th Street and Avenue B, which was not a great neighborhood, but my sister lived on 9th and C. So her and Richard wasn't in the picture at the time, but we we stayed close. We stayed in parallel lives for a few years. And Nield was one of the neighbors. There were tenants meetings. I think the first week I lived there, my apartment got broken into and I got robbed. You know, several months later, I got mugged with a fellow that had been outside pushing a baby carriage, and he ran in with a knife and cut off my pocketbook. And the tenants meetings were about these muggings and handing out police whistles. So fast forward a few months or the following year, my sister and myself and a friend were coming up the stairs. It was a 5th floor walk up. And these two guys barreled past us and turned toward in front of my friend who was in front of me. And I had no idea they were pointing a gun at him. And I blew my police whistle. And so this guy came flying out of Donald's apartment. It was his friend Steve, who I knew, and other people came flying out with their pots and pans and chased away the muggers. And then we were invited into Donald's apartment for tea. And it kind of evolved from there.
Wow, that's quite an introduction. So am I right that you became his studio assistant at some point?
It sounds very formal. I also had a job. You know, I went to school, I worked at a bookstore. So it wasn't a full-time paying job, but I did spend a lot of time. And that's what it evolved to. It was sort of a part-time job helping him, stretching canvas. I carried supplies. In the neighborhood at that time over around Broadway and 14th Street, there was a Utrecht store that sold art supplies. So I would go with him and help carry supplies. On one painting, I actually helped paint the background because it had a lot of these ridiculous, repetitious little flowers that he was using magic marker. So that was my job, to put in the little flowers and magic marker. And then he wanted to start cataloging. So that was my job, was to put stuff in a book. I had a little Smith Corona portable typewriter, and then some of his friends sometimes gave him ideas, sometimes they posed for pictures. It was sometimes a collaborative event. And the pictures, gradually, I took the pictures of the paintings. He had an old Kodak that he used to take, it was a single lens reflex, and I had a Pentax. So after I took some photography classes at Hunter, where I went to school, it was my job to do the slides, to take pictures. And then back then we had slides. We didn't have JPEGs or computers.
I'm curious, after that very dramatic kind of first meeting that you described, do you recall what your first impressions were of his paintings when you first went into his apartment?
Well, it was interesting because the one on the easel, my first impression was ugly, but it was a round painting with looked like a dead planet. There was an eclipse of the moon in the background on a cold looking landscape with some kind of fire coming up and a dead bird in the foreground. But the dead bird in the foreground was the redeeming feature because it was painted like the old masters that did the realistic animal paintings, which I was impressed with that. And it was, so I said, well, I think you can do better than that. I didn't realize that I had seen surrealist films, but I didn't realize that he did that on purpose, that the picture was ugly on purpose. And, you know, it was interesting. And he had done other paintings. So he showed us, I forget what else he showed us, but when we were there, he showed us other paintings. So, you know, so that was when I started seeing what he did.
Was his work shown widely at all in New York?
No, no, he may have been part of one small group show in Greenwich Village, but, you know, by amateurs, not, he was never in any major galleries or affiliated with any of the, you know, groups, the Ashcan School or the modern, whoever people. And I think towards the end, he had a show in a place called the Salmagundi Club. I believe he had some that he did for the New York City Ballet, but I couldn't tell you what or where.
Okay. Do you have any sense why he wouldn't have had shows? Is it something where he tried and it didn't connect, or is it something where he maybe really wasn't that interested in that aspect of the art world? Do you know why it would be?
Both. There were very overpowering circumstances and personalities in the art world. You know, there were people that were very big in professional art circles that the big galleries would show. And he was more interested in painting. I don't think any of us had the social skills to deal with the public display. He tried. He approached galleries from time to time. I know he went to Leo Castelli and you know, one or two other places, but I think they were usually so big and the people being shown were so established, and he was never established. You know, he had a small following. He did portraits. He did portraits for friends and friends of friends and relatives of friends, and then he evolved into his own style. And he admired some of these people that were being exhibited, but it was also the crossroads with minimalist, a lot of modern installation type stuff. He admired the photorealists like Richard Estes and people like that, and but he was more into the learning techniques. He was devoted to painting, I think, because it also helped. He had lung disease and he had depression, and I think he was more devoted to painting itself. He would have liked to have made a name. He did not. And that's also part of, I guess, why I thought, you know, maybe later I would make it a project to see if there was a way to have a small display of his paintings, even post-mortem, just because he deserved his 15 minutes like everybody else.
Well, his paintings are fascinating. Am I correct that this show that is opening in Olin Hall Galleries is essentially his first solo show?
I would say so. There was one small one, like I said, in Greenwich Village, probably in like a community center. You know, it wasn't really considered a major venue. So yes, and this is really a privilege. It's I'm extremely grateful to Talia and Lacey and my friend Susie and the school and the gallery and just how this worked out.
Okay. Do you feel like you can talk some about what led to this exhibition coming together?
Well, like our conversation with Todd, it sort of took off. I had before retirement, planned to work on this as some kind of a project, either to try to get him a show or write a book, or, you know, the typical retirement thing, do something with it. And after going through the program at Virginia Western, I started working on a biography and a mini portfolio of paintings. The mini will be given out at the show. And I started doing research. That's where it got interesting, because the cataloging of the paintings in 1974, he had me contact the Navy to see where the paintings ended up from the commissions that were done in the 60s. So I got this letter back from the Kitty Hawk with pictures, and that the paintings were in the dining room on the aircraft carrier, which was still in use at that time.
Oh, wow.
And they had a picture of another one that was in the dining room that I guess it walked off when the other carrier went into mothballs. But fast forward from 74 to around 2010, I didn't know. Every so many years I would check on the whereabouts of the aircraft carrier, because again, when we were kids, my dad would take us to New York. If an aircraft carrier was in town, we'd go see and go through that thing, getting on the boat and seeing the aircraft carrier and all of that stuff. And we'd go up to the Hudson River and see the wheat boats they had stored up there. And so I was on a message board and Googling the USS Kitty Hawk, and there was a message between one of the, I don't know what his official title was, but it was a fellow on the boat messaging with this woman, Faye Mitchell, from the North Carolina Historical Museum. And they were getting ready to retire the boat, and they wanted to do something with the paintings. And they were going to give them to the North Carolina Historical Museum, but somebody couldn't decipher the last name in the signature on the painting. And my antenna went way up, and I said, you know, if these are these paintings, then this is that artist. So after that, we exchanged emails and pictures and information, because I didn't have any official paperwork on the commission. All I had was what we wrote in the catalog, what Donald had dictated, you know, two pictures of the Wright brothers, two paintings with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, and then the follow-up letter with pictures in 1974 from the Navy. So there was some type of trail, whether that was considered provenance or not, because nobody could ever find the original, you know, requisition, or who ordered these paintings, you know, who the, you know, very beginning of this was. But so that was interesting. And at some point I drove down there to see them, and then in the research part, which was what I was getting into, I contacted a professor in the UK. And this was another fluke. A friend of mine in New York was doing his genealogy, and it was interesting. I had already done mine when I moved back to Roanoke. I had sort of worked on some family tree issues, and so this professor in UK turned out to be a gold mine of information, because he's the expert on the British living in China in the 1920s and pre-colonial. Oh, wow. Pre and post-colonial China, and he's still around today. So that was just another fluke and a gift. He never thought he'd even answer my email. So, and that started my research. Oops, let me get you back here. That really helped bolster my research, because that's when I started getting serious about trying to fill in all the background information that I either didn't have or only had little tiny snippets.
Okay. Well, one of the things I want to ask you about, because this is some very fascinating, striking work, you know, do you have any particular favorites among these pieces that are being displayed, you know, for the first time at Roanoke College? And why are they your favorites?
Well, there's some that are universal that everybody enjoys. There's one with Oscar Wilde in it, you know, and then there's a train in it and some flowers in the foreground. And so it's just visually pops out at you. You know, it's a pleasant, beautiful, attractive, well done paint. And some of the smaller ones I like because of the detail. There's one called Postage Stamp. Citroen is a blue, very stark blue and white and brown picture where he has a figure in it from one of the pre-Raphaelite artists. I liked the ones where he had these usually obscure references to other artists or people, because that's the part I like, is the research or the history. And the Melancholy of Richard Dadd, there's a picture of a hammer coming out of the wall with two hands coming out, and there's a decal up in the corner, and there's a silhouette of someone sitting in a chair. And nobody would have any idea who Richard Dadd was unless you Google Richard Dadd. Richard Dadd was a Victorian artist who did these exquisite fairy scenes, and he was schizophrenic before they called it schizophrenic, and he had a psychotic episode and killed his father and spent the rest of his life in insane asylums. And so Donald always had a way of finding these obscure people, and he was always empathetic with people with mental illness. You know, he had friends with mental illness. One of the people, I won't say who, one of the people in the paintings is still alive, but they went on to become an unmedicated bipolar, and, you know, basically live their once successful life in shambles on the streets until somebody helped get them located. So any of the pictures with somebody I knew in them, I like, of course, because it was sort of sentiment, but the history, there were references to things in history that are interesting.
Okay, so it's almost like some of them are almost eligible to be decoded, it sounds like, because of the references he puts in there. You can, that's really cool. I like that kind of thing myself. So what happens to The Coming of the Great Fish after it's done at Olin Hall, meaning the exhibit?
Washington and Lee are actually having a show in January. Theirs will run from January 9th to February 10th, or it might be January 10th to February 9th, but one of those two dates. And they have a guest lecturer, a fellow named Elliot King, who's an expert on surrealism, who'll be giving a lecture midway during the exhibit.
Do you think there's any chance of it traveling beyond that?
I don't know.
Fair enough. I was curious because I did see the Washington and Lee exhibit and wondered if maybe it wouldn't be going to some more places. Do you hope it goes to some more places?
I'd rather not say.
All right. Well, would you hope that more people become familiar with Donald Nield's work?
I think they will.
What would you hope that somebody who comes to this exhibit, what would you hope that they might get out of what they find in these paintings?
Well, I would hope they would enjoy them. I would hope they would just enjoy them, either as works of art or finding something that they could relate to visually, or read something that they found interesting. Talia is going, I believe, to put a little notebook or something out with a few pages with more in-depth decodings of the pictures. So, because some people do like that. They don't know what they're looking at, and you can help walk them through with a description or details. They find it more interesting and better able to engage. And then some people might not like them at all, and that's okay too.
Well, I think there's a lot to like. I feel like we've run a pretty good gamut of certainly of the questions that I had thought of. Is there anything you would like to say about Donald Nield or his art that maybe wasn't drawn out by what I've asked you so far?
Well, just that he was a very good friend. He was a mentor. He was empathetic with people. I felt I owed him a debt of gratitude because I was struggling in school, and he encouraged me. You know, he said, well, why don't you take art history? You can write about my paintings. And I never really took that very seriously. And I don't consider myself a professional art historian or anything, but it changed the trajectory of my life. And I know how he related to people. And I think, you know, so having him have this show is kind of a vindication of the fact that he never was well known, and unfortunately died young. And I think there will be people in the show that will really enjoy seeing them. And so that I'm very grateful for, and that's the best anybody could hope for.
Well, thank you very much, Esther, for sharing that with me.